In the winter of 1978, a family waited for a boy to come home. He had only meant to be gone a little while. He had finished his shift at a pharmacy in a quiet suburb northwest of Chicago, and before leaving, he told his mother he was going to speak with a man about a possible job. It sounded ordinary. It sounded practical. It sounded like the kind of small errand that should have ended with a front door opening, footsteps in the hall, and a familiar voice calling out from the entryway. But the boy did not return. As the hours passed, concern became fear. His family contacted police. Officers began asking questions at the pharmacy. They learned the name of the man who had spoken to him. They learned that the man was local, social, and well known enough that people recognized him from community events. He ran a construction business. He had employees. He had neighbors. He had a house on a quiet street, and in that house, beneath the ordinary rooms, beneath the floorboards and the furniture, and the shape of everyday life, investigators would soon find something that changed the way an entire city understood danger. Not danger in a dark alley, not danger from a stranger who looked frightening, but danger dressed in community respectability, danger with a handshake, danger with a business card, danger living next door. Tonight's story is about the slow unraveling of one of America's most disturbing documented criminal cases. It is a story of missed warnings, careful police work, grieving families, and young lives that deserved more time, more protection, and more attention. For now, we begin not with the name that became infamous. We begin with a missing boy, a winter evening, and the first loose thread in a terrible hidden pattern. Welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we are covering the documented case of John Wayne Gacy, a Chicago area contractor who was convicted in 1980 of murdering 33 young men and boys. The FBI's public case summary states that Gacy was convicted of murdering 33 young men ranging in age from 14 to 21, and that the FBI provided investigative assistance to Illinois police. This episode is written for calm, nighttime listening. The details are handled carefully, without graphic description, and with respect for the victims and their families. Some parts of the case are deeply upsetting, but the focus tonight is on the timeline, the investigation, the people affected, and the lasting questions that remain. So lower the lights, settle into a comfortable place, and let the story unfold slowly. John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois. Later accounts of his life describe him as someone who tried, in many ways, to appear successful and accepted. He worked, he married, he involved himself in local politics, he operated a construction business, and in his community, he built a public identity that made him seem approachable, useful, and ordinary. That public image mattered, because when people later tried to understand how so many young men and boys could vanish without the truth surfacing sooner, one answer came back, again and again. Gacy did not seem, at first glance, like the person people were being warned to fear. He lived in Norwood Park Township, near Chicago. His house was a modest ranch-style home at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue. From the outside, it was not remarkable. It sat in a neighborhood where people had routines, where cars pulled into driveways, where neighbors exchanged greetings, where the shape of daily life could hide almost anything if no one had reason to look too closely. Gacy owned PDM Contractors, a construction business. He hired young workers. Some were teenagers. Some were young men looking for steady pay, small jobs, or a way to earn money around school and family obligations. In the 1970s, before cell phones, digital records, and instant communication, It was easier for a young person to drift out of contact without triggering the kind of coordinated alerts we expect today. There were also social attitudes at the time that made some disappearances easier to dismiss. Young men who were assumed to be runaways, transient workers, or disconnected from home were not always investigated with urgency. Families could be left trying to convince authorities that their sons would not simply vanish. Gacy's public role made the contrast even sharper. Britannica notes that he was known in his suburban Chicago community for sociability and for performing as a clown at charitable events and children's parties. This detail became one of the most repeated parts of the case. But it can also distract from the real issue. The important fact is not the costume. The important fact is how a public-facing identity helped him move through the world with less suspicion than he deserved. Before the murders for which he became known, Gacy already had a serious criminal record. In 1968, he was convicted in Iowa for an offense involving a teenage boy and was sentenced to prison. He served a reduced amount of time before returning to Illinois. That prior conviction would later become important to investigators when they began looking into him after the disappearance of Robert Piest. By the mid to late 1970s, Gacy was living what looked, from the outside, like a busy life. He was a contractor. He hosted gatherings. He participated in community events. He had acquaintances in local politics. He interacted with families, workers, neighbors, and business contacts. And all the while, young men and boys were disappearing. Some had known Gacy. Some had worked for him. Some had crossed paths with him briefly. Some were not immediately connected to him at all. In many of their stories, there were familiar human details: a job opportunity, a conversation, a last sighting, a family waiting for word. These were not simply names in a case file. They were sons, brothers, friends, classmates, and co-workers. The known victims included teenagers and young adults. Some were identified early. Others remained unidentified for decades. The Cook County Sheriff's Office states that 5 victims recovered from Gacy's residence in late 1978 and early 1979 remain unidentified, and that modern DNA technology has been used in continuing efforts to identify them. That fact alone gives this case a quiet, lasting sadness. Even after conviction, even after execution, even after decades of books, documentaries, articles, and public attention, there are still families somewhere who may not know that their missing loved one was part of this story. The crimes connected to John Wayne Gacy took place primarily during the 1970s, in and around the Chicago area. He was eventually convicted of 33 murders. The Illinois Supreme Court's 1984 decision in People v. Gacy records that he was charged with 33 counts of murder, and after trial was found guilty of the murder counts as well as other charges. The exact details of each victim's final hours are not all known, and this episode will not dwell on the physical violence. What can be said, carefully, is that Gacy used trust, opportunity, and manipulation. He often made contact through work, promises of employment, or casual social interaction. Several victims were connected to his construction business or were young people looking for work. The setting was often his home. That house became central to the case. It was not remote. It was not hidden in wilderness. It was part of an ordinary neighborhood. Inside it, Gacy maintained the appearance of normal life, while beneath and around the property, he concealed many of the victims. Investigators ultimately discovered human remains in the crawl space beneath the house and elsewhere on the property. Other victims were later connected to remains recovered from the Des Plaines River. Contemporary summaries and later reporting consistently describe 29 bodies found on or near the property and 4 more associated with the river, though some details vary by source and legal wording. Britannica summarizes the case as involving the murders of 33 boys and young men in the 1970s. What makes the case so difficult to sit with is not only the number of victims, but the length of time over which the crimes continued. A person does not become invisible all at once. A missing son leaves behind a room. A missing brother leaves behind family questions. A missing coworker leaves behind a last day, a last paycheck, a last person who remembers seeing him. But when systems are slow to connect those disappearances, patterns remain hidden. Gacy benefited from that delay. He also benefited from assumptions. Some victims were young men on the margins, or were treated as though they might have simply left home. During the 1970s, police departments did not have the same national missing person databases, DNA tools, or rapid information sharing systems that investigators can use today. Even now, missing person investigations are complicated. Then, they were often fragmented by geography, paperwork, and prejudice. There were warning signs. There were prior allegations. There were survivors. There were people who had unsettling encounters with Gacy and later tried to make sense of them. But the full truth remained hidden until December 1978. When 15-year-old Robert Piest disappeared. Robert worked at a pharmacy in Des Plaines, Illinois. On December 11, 1978, he was nearing the end of his shift when he mentioned that he planned to speak with a contractor about a possible job. That contractor was John Wayne Gacy. Robert's mother was waiting nearby. When Robert did not return, concern rose quickly. Unlike some earlier disappearances, this one was reported promptly, and investigators had a clear lead almost immediately. The man Robert had gone to meet, that mattered. It gave police a name, and with that name, they began to find the past. The investigation into Robert Piest's disappearance began as a missing person case. Detectives spoke with people at the pharmacy and learned that Robert had planned to meet Gacy. When police questioned Gacy, he gave explanations that did not hold steady. He denied knowing where Robert was, but the timeline drew attention. Investigators then found Gacy's prior Iowa conviction. That changed how they viewed him. A man who had spoken with a missing teenager now had a documented history involving harm to a young person. Police obtained a search warrant for his house. During the search, investigators found items that raised concern. Some were later connected to victims or suspected victims. They did not yet have the full picture, but they had enough to keep watching. Gacy was placed under surveillance. This part of the investigation was slow, tense, and strange. Detectives followed him as he drove from place to place. They watched his movements. They waited for him to make a mistake. Gacy appeared to know he was under pressure. He spoke with lawyers. He behaved erratically at times. The investigation was no longer just about a missing boy. It was beginning to point towards something much larger. Then came the smell. Officers who had entered the house noticed an odor coming from the crawlspace area. Gacy gave explanations for it, but investigators were not satisfied. Eventually, after more evidence developed, police obtained a second search warrant. On December 21, 1978, Gacy was arrested. The search of the property became one of the most grim and consequential in American criminal history. Investigators began excavating the crawl space beneath the house. They found remains. Then more. Then more. The work was physically difficult and emotionally heavy. The crawl space was low and cramped. Investigators had to move carefully, documenting locations and preserving evidence as they uncovered what had been hidden below the home. Gacy eventually confessed to multiple killings, though his statements shifted over time. He later denied responsibility in various ways, suggested alternative explanations, and made claims that investigators and courts did not accept as changing the core evidence against him. The case moved toward trial. Gacy was charged in Cook County with 33 murders. His defense did not seriously dispute that the killings had occurred or that the bodies had been found. The main legal issue became his mental state and whether he was legally responsible. Prosecutors argued that he knew what he was doing and acted with planning and concealment. The jury agreed. In March 1980, John Wayne Gacy was convicted. He was sentenced to death for some of the murders and to additional prison terms for others. The Illinois Supreme Court later upheld his convictions, noting the scope of the charges and the jury's findings. The trial gave the public a formal ending in one sense. The man responsible had been convicted. The evidence had been presented. The sentence had been imposed. But for the families, legal closure was not the same as peace. Some families had waited years for answers. Some learned their loved ones had been misidentified or remained unidentified. Some had to live with the knowledge that earlier warnings had not stopped the crime. And some families still did not know whether their missing son, brother, or friend was among the unnamed victims. The John Wayne Gacy case is solved in the legal sense. Gacy was arrested, tried, convicted, and sentenced. He was executed by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center on May 10, 1994. Britannica records his death on that date, following his conviction and death sentence. But the case still has unresolved parts. The first unresolved part is identification. As of the Cook County Sheriff's public information page, 5 victims connected to Gacy remain unidentified. The Sheriff's Office explains that the remains were recovered in late 1978 and early 1979, and that DNA technology has been used to continue the effort to restore their names. This is one of the most important modern aspects of the case. For decades, unidentified victims were often described by numbers, case labels, or forensic estimates. But behind each label was a person with a life before Gacy. Modern forensic genealogy has already helped identify some previously unknown victims, including Francis Wayne Alexander, whose identification was announced in 2021 by the DNA Doe Project in collaboration with the Cook County Sheriff's Office. The second unresolved part is whether there were additional victims. Gacy sometimes made statements suggesting there could be more, but his statements were inconsistent, self-serving, and not always reliable. Investigators have examined possible links to other disappearances, and the FBI maintains public files related to the case, reflecting federal investigative assistance and documentation. It is important not to turn speculation into fact. Gacy was convicted of 33 murders. There may be questions about other missing persons, but not every disappearance from the period can be responsibly attributed to him. Families of missing people deserve care, not rumors. The third unresolved part is institutional. How did he continue for so long? That question does not have one simple answer. It includes the limits of 1970s investigative tools. It includes failures to connect cases. It includes social bias against certain victims. It includes Gacy's ability to seem respectable. It includes the fact that young men and boys were not always believed, protected, or searched for with equal urgency. In hindsight, patterns look obvious. At the time, they were scattered across families, police reports, workplaces, neighborhoods, and assumptions. That is one of the lessons of this case. A missing person is never just a statistic. A report that seems minor can become part of a larger pattern. A survivor's account matters. A family's insistence matters. Small facts matter. The final unresolved part is moral rather than legal. No conviction can restore the lost years. No sentence can return a child to his mother. No headline can make a family whole. The best that can be done now is to remember the victims as people, to support identification efforts, and to tell the story without turning suffering into spectacle. The house on West Summerdale Avenue is gone now. It was demolished after the crimes were discovered. The physical structure that hid so much was removed, and another home was eventually built on the lot. But the absence of the house did not erase the memory of what happened there. Some crimes leave behind more than evidence. They leave behind questions about trust. They leave behind changes in how communities understand danger. They leave behind families who measure time in two parts: before the disappearance and after. John Wayne Gacy's name became infamous. But his name should never be the center of the story. The center belongs to the young men and boys whose lives were taken. It belongs to Robert Piest, whose disappearance finally brought the truth into the open. It belongs to the identified victims, whose families had to absorb the unimaginable. It belongs to the unidentified victims who are still waiting, in a sense, to be returned to their names. The case also belongs to the investigators who kept digging, literally and figuratively, until the hidden pattern could no longer remain hidden. And it belongs to the lesson that evil does not always announce itself in a way people expect. Sometimes it smiles, sometimes it volunteers. Sometimes it hires workers. Sometimes it lives in a house with neighbors close by. But sometimes, too, the truth begins with one family refusing to accept silence. A mother waited. A boy did not come home. And because his disappearance was pursued, because questions were asked, because the thread was followed, a terrible secret beneath an ordinary house was finally brought into the light. May the victims be remembered by their names. May the unidentified be found. And may the story be told with care. Thank you for listening to this calm, true crime story for sleep. This case is heavy, and it deserves a quiet ending. As you rest, let the focus remain not on fear, but on remembrance, patience, and the importance of listening when someone is missing. Sleep well, and take care.